So first and foremost, we are finding ourselves at a time where language is ever evolving. The LGBTQIR and so on and so forth acronyms alone have been ever growing just in the last 5 years, as far as I can remember. When I started in the movement, it was just LGBTI, and it's now become LGBTIQ, it's become LGBTIQ plus, it's become a whole list of things. And I thought it was important that as Eswatini sexual and gender minorities, we discuss these issues. So first and foremost, I'm going to give Sam, and I hope, Sam, you can help us. Just start by speaking about the history of the language of the LGBT community. How do we find, describe, and contextualize the histories of same-sex love and gender identity in academic and public histories, especially the aspect of language?
I think a lot of us have started queer theory or engaged with queer theory at some point and really trying to understand how language is played out over the years, especially when we look at the Western context. When words like queer, homosexual, and then gay emerged, and how people struggled a lot of times with words like morphe, which were in some way were used in a derogatory way. And many of us I came out in the 90s and actually in the 80s. And at that time, the words that were quite familiar with most of us were either gay, lesbian, or homosexual, and also queer and morphe were still sort of used in a very derogatory way. But I think what I've seen over the years is that people have tended to claim some of these words and own them in order to take away the power that these words had in terms of the negativity in trying to make positivity out of it. But then when you also look at the African context with some of the readings that I've done over the years, with various books, some of you might be familiar with the Unspoken Word or Husband and Wives and so on. It tries to unpack the also African perspective in terms of some of the words that were used in different cultures and the naming that came with that. But what I see as sort of similarities, but also contrary to what the Western perspective is around this naming, was that some of these names in the African context were used more around the practices and behaviors of people than actually claiming them as identities. But when you look at the queer history in the Western world, a lot of the naming and the language that was used then became sort of identities beyond just the sodomy issue or homosexuality that was seen then. So the issue of language is sort of transcended. I think it has changed and evolved over the years, whether we're looking at the African context or even looking at the history. And part of it was also expressed through images or imagery. If you look in the Western context, there are images, or even in Asia, that you can sort of depict issues around gender issues, sexuality, and embracing it. And I think the struggle that we have today is, have we simply, especially in the African context, have we simply assimilated languages of other parts of the world without growing our own language that we can claim in our own context, which is relatable to the people? And that's where I'll leave it for now.
Thank you, Sam. So you're asking us a question of, have we only assimilated a Western or Eurocentric language without looking at our own perhaps language development? And I'm interested in something that you mentioned earlier, the issue of describing acts and not specifically identities. I want to take this to Virginia, someone who has a very big history in working in the LGBT space. And specifically for a country like South Africa that has developed, they are as far as having legislation that looks at hate speech. Virginia, perhaps you can walk us through how we have moved away from using language that is specific to us in our context and use a Western language instead of using our own language.
This is a complex issue because for me, I don't think we can separate the issue of the involvement of how people began to understand their identities or their practices, as Sam was saying, and to the issue of language. For instance, I want to make an example. People like myself, we've known lesbian and gay for the longest time. Before that, it was never spoken about. And in our languages and in our culture, it was referred to something different. I remember in most of the Nguni languages, it used to be called Inkenchane if someone has a certain relationship with a man, if he is a man. And as time went on and people began to realize themselves and science evolved, people were able to say, actually, I am not a lesbian. I am a trans woman. And then that's when we started to try and find the names. And that is not happening rapidly as it happens in the West. It's not happening in our context. And precisely because the environment is different. The environment in the West is different from the environment here. Even within the continent itself, what's happening in Zimbabwe is very different from what is happening in South Africa. We might already have some terms which people in Zimbabwe do not have yet, but as soon as people are able to identify themselves as those terms, they will then begin to find the appropriate word or the name that they would associate their being with. And it's a very long process, and it's highly complex as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Virginia. I think you are touching an important question that was raised by Sam earlier before we started this meeting. Can we live without language or words that label us? I'm bringing this up because you mentioned the issue of, for so long, misidentifying ourselves. I mean, on the flip side of it, we are identifying ourselves with language that is borrowed from the West. I want to bring in Menusi. To walk us through the issue of identity, especially for trans and intersex people. Do you find that historically we have had language in our own context that has correctly described us, whether or not describing specific acts or describing identities?
Okay. For us here in Zimbabwe, we do not have, Shona words that really describe an intersex or a transgender person. From our Shona culture or from our Shona language, the only words that we had, which were used to describe lesbians, gays, trans, intersex, were the term which is called non-to-be-ngwachani, meaning to say, okay, if you are a girl who's acting, let's say if you are a trans woman, you are a girl, you are a man who's acting like a woman, and would actually use some of the terms that are known to koskana, meaning to say that you're a man but you're acting as a woman. And also, so in our Zimbabwean context, the only word that we had, or rather the words that we had, were koskana or ngochani. Those are the only two that we actually have here in Zimbabwe.
Have you found them to be harmful though?
Yes, actually, those have actually been they've actually brought harm to the society, to the LGBTI community society, because you find that if you are to be seen in public spaces, or if anyone is to call out the word Ngochani whilst you're in public, they'll actually be calling out harm to you. And you find that with those Shona words, they actually carry a deeper meaning more than the word trans or intersex itself. You find that even if you are to walk and into a space and identify and say to people, I identify as trans, people might actually ignore it or might actually want to know more. But once you walk in a space and people actually refer you to as Ngochani, people will not even bother to listen to what you have to say next, or even to find out if you are truly whether you are intersex or whether you are trans.
Sibonelo, I want to bring you in on this one. Have you found the historical use of language like ingongoni, stabani to be harmful? I mean, I understand that perhaps today it might be understood to want to cause harm or want to insult. But in your experience, historically, were these words meant to harm, or were these just one of the words that perhaps Sam says they were describing specific acts and not necessarily identity?
Afternoon, guys. I think I'll first start by saying that language is going to change with each generation, so we will never solve language in our time. And I don't think even the future generation will even be able to solve it or have words that will explain or describe who they are. However, going back to your question, I think historically words like Nkongoni, Ngengili, Talase were words which were beautiful words and had beautiful meaning. There were words which were sacred, there were words which were celebrated. But we know with our history, when Jan van Riebeeck landed in Cape Town, what had happened. Words and acts and the way that we used to live changed. And some words then, according to the Bible or according to a book, were then seen as being evil and should no longer be used. I've worked much in rural areas. For example, in Lusikisiki, the word italase, which will describe somebody with two sexes, which will be an intersex person. It's still celebrated there. It's not a word which is seen to be bad even today. Where when somebody is called italase, it's most of the time they will think that it's a person who has ancestors, two types of ancestors, a man and a female. And so if it's still alive there today, maybe it's words that then maybe we should reclaim and use. And also in the rural context, where when we use language, words like intersex, gay, trans, queer, so many of these of these words, you tend to then confuse the people you are trying to have a conversation with because they do not know those words. They know their own words. But the moment you start using the words that they know, which will be Nkonkoni, Stabane, Unengili, of course, some at the beginning might resist wanting to engage. But once you start engaging them with their own language, people are more open and they even then take you back to history and say in the past or in our village, or my granny said, or my grandfather said, there used to be people like this. And those people weren't really discriminated at that time and using those words. So I think I'm going back to how I started when I said language will change. Language is also not innocent. Language is very dangerous. Like I think the previous speaker has touched on the word when it's uttered out, it then calls on danger. It's the same word when we use in a township, when somebody calls you stubborn in a township, that word could bring about harm onto you. So a community in a township and a community in a rural area are two different kinds of communities, and they're influenced by two different kinds of it's the economy, it's the culture, it's the upbringing. So if I shout stubborn in a taxi rank, probably a person might get beaten and maybe killed in South Africa. But maybe if I talk about stubborn in Lgbt, for example, or talk about Italas in Port St. John's, it could be a different outcome. So it also depends on where we are and how we have been brought up. Yeah, so it differs, and we will be having this conversation 20 years down the line. We will be having the same problems because I believe language is like a person trying to find their identity. It's like Sibonelo 10 years ago, Sibonelo would have maybe identified as a gay man, but Sibonelo today doesn't want to identify with anything because I have changed so many times. I don't know what box I should fit myself in, and if I do need to fit myself in any of those boxes. So there's a book which is quite nice, which I've read, which is called Ethical Slut. It talks about sex, but however, it talks about claiming words which were used to dehumanize people, words like slut, bitch, and all of those things. I think maybe as a movement, we should take a leaf out from that book, maybe on how to then reclaim words, Like the West has reclaimed the word queer, and I see in South Africa and in Africa as well, we are now using the word queer. And maybe like we use the word Stabande when I'm in Johannesburg and in other townships, we use the word in Konkoni when I'm in eThekwini. Maybe we do need to start reclaiming our own words and celebrating them, because quite frankly, and to be honest, the word gay is not our word. It's not us. And when you try to talk to somebody who is from Africa and will tell you that being gay is un-African, maybe they're right in a way when they say being gay is not African, but being Konkoni is African.
Yeah.
The word gay is African itself.
Yeah. I just want to bring in Jamil, if you allow me. Jamil has joined us. He is doing his PhD on critical diversity studies. I want to understand from your own perspective, Jamil, do you think something went wrong in terms of our local language, in terms of how we use language? We are hearing from the news that in Zimbabwe, the usage of localized language is meant to cause harm. And we cannot deny that. And I'm hearing from Siponi and I who's saying, these were historically beautiful words that were meant to describe who we are. What has gone wrong today?
I was listening to everybody's contributions, and throughout each one, the same thought kept coming up for me, and that is colonization. I don't think it's smart or worth delinking this conversation from that history of colonization. And I think, you see, the issue, this conversation has been had many times, and people will tell you that historically in African communities, words were used for practical purposes. Words were used to denote differences between people, but those differences weren't necessarily stigmatized. And people lived happily like that. The issue is, as a continent, we were colonized. And when that colonization happened, the consequences for being different changed. And it became punitive and punishable by law. And then people obviously then, what I imagine is worth exploring is the way in which those words which previously had very harmless meanings remained, but now in a context whereby people had to be punished for who they were. And so the language didn't necessarily evolve to reflect the meaning that was now attached to it, but colonizers also then took, in some ways, imported new language, but then in some ways also took the language that existed and attached meanings to it that that describe people who deserve to be punished for who they are. And I think also, you know, as African people in general, we've been different contexts experience colonization in different ways. I come from a context where I was raised in Cape Town, in a colored community, and if I'm listening to this conversation now, I'm just thinking about the fact that I've never known a word in my community that wasn't derogatory for who I am. And that also has something to do with the fact that I come from a community and a culture that was heavily colonized, maybe more so than the extent to which other communities were colonized. And so I don't know a word in my immediate history that wasn't used derogatorily towards me. And so in that sense, I don't have the experience of knowing language that wasn't ever derogatory. So the way in which that process happened cannot ever be delinked from the fact. So when we talk about also like adopting or importing or assimilating into language, we must remember that this was a process that was done by force. There was no choices given. And if you refused, you were killed. So in some ways, we need to maybe also be a little bit kinder to ourselves in the ways in which we take on responsibility for how we've adopted language. Because the truth is, we adopted that language while staring down the barrel of a gun.
Yeah. Perhaps I should take this back to Virginia. Virginia, how do you think we should claim these identities if today they are proving to be harmful?
It is, it is very hard to embrace the word or the name that brings harm to yourself. For instance, even if you name a child Umpiak, right? And then a child grows up with that name, and then everyone, whenever they see that child, they see a fight, right? So if you are named Inkonkoni, and the manner in which it's said, the tone that is used also says a lot, right? So sometimes you find that if someone says Istabane, you are okay. But if someone says Nazle Itabane, that's different, right? But then maybe the manner in which we can claim them is to also try to, whenever in terms of organizing and talking to people outside the LGBTI community, we use the languages that people are comfortable with, and stop being, becoming those people that use big words and leave people not understanding exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
But then that means there's more work that needs to be done, because then we need to cleanse the word first, right? And make it appealing and appear as not a derogatory word or a word that says something bad. But the more use of the word will make people understand that it is not a bad word, but it refers to a person like this, and it does not mean that that person has something wrong or has done something wrong. And this then takes us to a point where we need to begin to conduct our sensitization workshops in a way that is more inclusive in terms of language.
How do you heal the differences between someone who is terrified of being called Intugumbili or Ingongoni, or some of these words in Shona that Munesi mentioned that I can't repeat? How do we balance the two, trying to sensitize ourselves into owning these words?
I like this saying that says, language is not innocent, because it determines the reality, it creates logic, but then sometimes we can't escape from it. Because when I claim I'm lesbian, to start with, I like the example that was given. A lot of us came out and say I'm gay in the 80s. Somewhere along the line, I realized, probably don't really go well with the other guy that says I'm gay. I'm actually want to transition. Maybe in my dressing, in my thoughts and everything, I don't really quite fit in what people have said I am. So today you find that the difficulties we have is that you wake up, someone says, I think I'm a trans man, I'm a trans woman. And at one point they were saying lesbian. In our own little groups, we say that's fine. But when the world looks at you, they don't want you to escape the first label. They'll say, is that not a fake lesbian? Or is that not fashionable? Is it now the trend of, following up the new norm of being trans? And sometimes the difficulties with language is that it prevents us from finding solutions and new ideas. So a lot of us, if I like that, I've known Virginia for so long. When we came out and say we are gay, these are words that we simply borrowed from the Western world. I've never sat in a space in the 80s and 90s where people were talking in Shona and naming what they were in Shona, because there isn't. Because the difficult also is that language itself, especially when you look at the Shona context, has limited words. A lot of these words that we now have, we had to translate them from English to Shona, because when you look at the way Shona language is, it's more descriptive than to have one word. So when someone was born an intersex in my community, way back, these are people that were hidden. You were not allowed to go and bath with other boys. you were not allowed
Or
to
killed.
show, or girls, you were not, or killed. Parents had to hide you in a hut. If they were coming from a family or living within a missionary institution which had a hospital, a doctor will simply ask the parent, what sort of gender do you want? And gender assignment is done then slowly over the years. Some people that I've met who were intersex but had had surgery done to assign a certain gender, which in their adulthood do not identify with. Actually tell you, I started having surgeries when I was doing my primary school, and I had my last surgery when I was doing my A levels. It's because of that restriction of language, because they wanted to fit this child into a specific label, which is a girl or a boy. So you find that the limitation that language has, it's also difficult. But then again, in our discourse within the queer movement, we've never questioned issues of language within our own context. Yes, we do relate it to the issue of history. When we are referring to history, we are not constructing our own labeling. We are simply saying there's Ngocha and there's Morphe. But then we've never asked ourselves, so what label do we want that is comfortable? And sell it through the various media platforms, documentation, and so on, so that it becomes a word that people can assimilate and accept as the word. Because the language that we are talking about, someone created the word gay. It didn't simply fall out of the sky and everyone started using it. Someone came up with it. I always like to refer people to the Beyonce song. Oh, I love Beyonce. When we talk about the word bootylicious, to start with, the word bootylicious was there somewhere, but then someone tell it to us, and all of a sudden it's now in a dictionary. It now describes what it is and so on. But within our own queer movement in Africa, we have not really reconstruct or reconfigure the language to suit our own context. Because what I want to say is, if I'm to go into a village today, what am I going to say I am? I'm gay? They'll say, what is gay? Is that an English thing? And then when I said, oh, gay means I'm attracted to this, oh, that Western thing you're borrowing from meeting white people in the city. Or you're watching in movies. Or you're reading in newspapers. But the moment I say, I feel the descriptive words, but if I say to them, oh, I feel like a woman, they'll start thinking, oh, in our context, they'll say, oh, maybe it's possession. You're possessed by your aunt. Because that's what they know. Or they might say, if you are a girl acting like a boy, you're a tomboy. Tomboy in Shona, they'll say, it's like saying you are a girl who likes to act like a boy. In Shona, they'll say, it's almost saying you're a boy that wants to act like a girl. They don't have one word. So if we are going to talk about how do we contextualize this language, let's revisit that very history. Some of these words that we say we are uncomfortable, unpack them, and then say what it is that we want to call ourselves. We can create our own language that we can sell and define what it is and get it into a dictionary, because that's how words are formed. Every day there are new words that are emerging. And it's easier then when you go to the international platform to say the word gay in my context, in my community, this is what it now means, and this is what we mean. And we own it. Because as long as we're going to expect people to construct our own words, it's difficult. And lastly, I want to say that the most difficult thing I've seen in our context is that most of the activism that we do, it's urban-centric. We are usually having these conversations in conferences that are located within the cities, within our local neighborhoods, which are high-density suburbs, or our village. It's very rare to sit down with a chief and say, when you see me and you have heard about me in our own culture, what does that even mean? Even if it's going to be descriptive, how then do we construct a language that is understood by our own communities? Because from Zimbabwe, for example, 60% of the population live in the village. So those are the very people that have an impact in terms of how we change the narrative of homophobia in Africa. And I also like the reference that was made that a lot of it will also comes with colonialism. Yeah, sodomite. It's colonialism. That's how people look at it. Yeah, sodomite. But then you said, but in my context, didn't you have men who act like, oh, we had those, they do it when they are herding cattle.
Yeah.
And it ends there.
Yeah.
So they cannot really relate the two because the labeling and the innocence of language is lost. So the only way we can find solution to this is to deconstruct the issue around language and in its innocence.
I just want to find your perspective. Do you think there is room for us to work with these chiefs in terms of learning? I wanted to find out if we think there is room for us to work.
Maybe Sibonelo can answer that question for us.
Yes, please. Someone just answer the question. Do we think there is room for us to learn?
I'm not sure how the chiefs who are actually not willing to accept us can then be part of reconstructing our identity.
You have to have
I think there is room. I've had the privilege of training chiefs of Amampondo and of Amampondo, both in Libote and in Engelini, and also worked with quite a lot of traditional communities in Ekopo. I think we underestimate, or we have this idea that chiefs are all homophobic. Chiefs are not all homophobic. Chiefs are quite open. Chiefs are willing to learn. Chiefs are, and they will play a big part in changing society. I'll make an example with me growing up training chiefs of Amampondo in Libote. I've trained them. It was under an AFSA program. So I trained them for a week. First day I came there, I wore a pants and a jacket. Second day I wore a t-shirt and a long pants. Third day I was pants and a t-shirt which is written homophobia. Fourth day I was wearing a short. The fifth day I was wearing a really short shorts and a very tight shirt. And to them, they didn't notice the change that I was doing throughout, because by the time we got to fifth day, they saw me as a Sibonelo, not as a gay person or whatever they wanted to call me then. But what was really nice to hear was from AFSA. When AFSA had a conference, they always have these conferences, and one of the chiefs was registering in the conference, and the person was asking, are you male, female, or other? And because it was a chief, the person ticked male. The chief then confronted the person and says, but who told you that I am a male? What if I don't identify with that? I think that really said something to me, that chiefs are not people who want to kill their community. Chiefs want the best for their community. Well, that's most of the chiefs. So there is room. I think it's the approach. How do you then approach a chief? I think Sam talked a lot about how we used to do things in our context and how we used to use language. The English language has just a word for something or things, but our words describe things. And once you start describing things and using language in that way, our people understand it better. It's the same with me. If you describe something to me, I understand it better than you just coming telling me this is this and leaving it there. Because if you're leaving it there, I'm not sure the gray areas where do they fall into. So yes, answering your question, yes, I think like Virginia has said, a lot needs to be done with our people, but it's the way we need to approach this that needs to be clever. It needs to be different from how we have been doing it. And of course, with our funders, they want to see reports with us writing gay, lesbian empowerment and all of those fancy words. Maybe we need to have a conversation with our funders as well. But maybe we don't want to use these words, and our reports won't reflect what you want to see. Our reports will reflect us explaining what was point A and how did we get to point B, instead of ticking boxes of gay, lesbian, and trans. And the harm that we also do, I think I forget, because the harm, I feel so guilty sometimes now when I see, I'll say kids. I don't want to give them any gender. When I grew up working for, I won't say the organization, but working for a gay organization, we used to almost force people into finding boxes. in the way we had our dialogues, in the way we had lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, we actually like force people into finding boxes. And when I see people now on social media not identifying with anything, and people who used to identify as lesbian then and who are now trans men, I feel quite bad that maybe I confused this person for quite some time. Me keep on saying lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and those are the only boxes you can fit in, and that's the only community that we will have. Maybe us looking into maybe the model of Togi, for example, where I don't really put a person into any box, but a person falls into the whole word, and everybody is included in that space.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
very important.
yeah. So
That's very
yeah.
important, Bono.
Yeah, I can go on, Eugene. Yeah, I think that was it for me.
Well, thank you, Sponile. While you are here, I just want to find out from you, how do you think we should move into those rural spaces where we can learn from our elders and perhaps from chiefs how to use language that we can identify with at the local level?
Thank you, Melusi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Tutu
Ah.
from LPQRS. I think it's like Swanelo is saying, it's not as difficult with their chiefs. I don't think in our context it's the same. We are in the same position because our chiefs are really at the, if it was a pyramid, they're at the top, and they are the ones just above religious leaders who are constantly out there in the media and actually visible, saying we will not accept this. So it's important. I know some people have tried to do it. There has been, I know Congo has tried to sensitize chiefs, but there's a difference when you bring chiefs into a workshop with living back with the chiefs back in their communities, because when they are wearing suits, they will be speaking English and they will understand. But when they get back to the circle there at the Inkundla Center, it's a different story altogether, because they have also to purport to listen to the rest of the people that are there, of which the rest of the people who are there mostly are saying, we will not accept this.
Yeah.
But in terms of the kind of language that maybe we can use there, I'm not sure whether stabane is even a Swazi word, for instance. It's a word that I grew up. I mean, when I discovered myself, the first word I knew that I identified with was gay, even before stabane. So I heard Nana saying maybe some of the words are just words that we should accept. But I didn't know those words growing up. I'm not even sure whether it's a Swati word, because I've also heard it being used in I don't know whether it's Zulu or Xhosa. So I'm not sure how to fit myself in there with that word. So when it comes to how we really speak to the chiefs, maybe I can agree to say the description is much better than actually saying I'm a lesbian woman or I'm a woman who dates or is attracted to other women.
I'm also interested to find out if the reception to the chiefs of a lesbian is the same as receiving a gay man in terms of issues around patriarchy.
Yeah. I honestly, in our context, I don't think I can even say there's a difference or not, because it's just, well, as far as I know, it's just not penetratable at the moment. So I feel like it's level. the fact that you are LGBTI on its own, whether you are male or female, is just you are treated the same way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say there's any difference really that I've noted.
There's real difficulty in trying to penetrate those sort of spaces. However, I'm wondering if we cannot use, maybe moving away from the traditional structures, looking at the family structure,
Exactly.
Gogos and Kulus, perhaps there's something to learn there. I wanted to take it to Melusi in Zimbabwe, but I can see Trevor is still here. Trevor, if you could allow us just a moment to walk us through how you see us trying to find dignified words or dignified language that would explain or express the LGBTIQ plus community.
I think it's actually quite important that we have, words that describe ourselves in our languages, and I find that that's very lacking, especially when it comes to the trans community generally. Because most of these terms they describe sexual orientation more than they do gender identity. So there's a form of erasure in that sense. That there's no way for us to properly express who we are, especially when you're talking to the older people, or Gogo and all of them, when you're trying to explain exactly what it means to be yourself, you find yourself very limited. And so I think it's very vital that we have the type of language that accommodates all people within the community. But then again, I ask myself, well, this is a question, rather. I've been meaning to ask it anyway. And now that I have an opportunity, I guess the question is, how do we go about that? Because, usually language is something that evolves on its own naturally. But in this case, we're trying to introduce, language and put it out there. And it's quite a mammoth task because, in the first place, we are a community that is fighting to be heard, to get reception and be understood. So I guess my question is, how exactly are we the ones that will sit down, and come up with the words in our languages that we believe best describes who we are, and then we take it to the community? Or are we counting on, going back in history and trying to figure out from the elders and all of them what words do they have for us? And then, how exactly, what's the best method to go about this?
Is it necessary to label ourselves? And if so, how do we go about trying to find these languages or this language that would be helpful?
Well, I think for me, I think this has to be a parallel process. I don't think it's impossible, it's possible.
Yeah.
Parallel process in the sense that we need to have a local discourse with different structures of our community. If the chiefs are difficult, like you said, let's do with the family. We do have some groups of PFLEGs that we've created. Let's have that conversation. There are some people that are not really traditional chiefs, but they are also community influencers or gatekeepers. Let's have that conversation. The reason I'm saying it's not impossible is that, let's give an example. When Corona came, or COVID-19 came, it started creating a whole new language about how we should be conducting ourselves. And interestingly enough, people started translating some of that English language into Ndebele, Shona, to try and describe what it was, how it's done. And I have had so many words that I've never heard before to try and unpack what that is and how people should be relating to each other. No one knew where that was. Somebody in the health sector said, maybe if we describe it this way, it will work. And people say, is this how we say it in Shona? I've never heard of such language. But we simply jumped on it and started using it now. So I think while we ourselves, the community, need to have that conversation, what word are we comfortable? Because people always say to me, I'm not comfortable with the word Ngochan or Esteban. And I'm saying, okay, so what do you want people to call you? They have no clue. They want to be called John. Okay, they'll call you John. And then if they call you John, then say, but they're not, they're not respecting my identity. And what the identity is that it's gay. But there's no language in our that says gay. So let's come up with a solution. I remember a couple of years ago, AMSHA had a T-shirt. I think some of you had that T-shirt, where they asked people around Africa, what sort of names do you call each other that you are comfortable with? There was Ngochani, there was something, and it created the shape of Africa. I'm sure some of you have seen that t-shirt.
Yes.
But we have simply forgotten those words because those are the very words that we supplied ourselves to say we are okay. In Zimbabwe, if you call someone Oda as an example, it was like Oda as in English, but then it was translated to be O-R-D-A-A. When we are in public and we say Uri Oda or we are Oda, everyone, we understand what that means and we are proud. You're like, oh, I'm Oda, my Oda, where are you going? It's almost like, you know, it became a language.
Yeah.
Why don't we own it? Why don't we sell it? Why don't we unpack what order means in ourselves? And the more they see, I like somebody who says, the more we write these words in our reports, the more we make them visible on our websites, on our social media platforms, they will catch up just like we do the hashtag this and hashtag that. Why can't we do hashtag order? Why can't we do hashtag this that we are comfortable with? With time, I'm sure with language, as innocent it is, we are finding our own solution. But I think the discourse with communities needs to be done.
Yeah, but Sammy, I wanted to come back to the issue of the words that we found during the research. Do you know that there is always fight amongst us LGBT? I mean, other people are comfortable being gay. Other people are not comfortable being. You've made that example.
If I can come in there, I actually also wanted to ask how we handle, because someone talked about reclaiming slurs and using them on ourselves so that, they lose their power and all that. But I remember watching this video of an older gay man that was on YouTube, and he was saying how he was very uncomfortable with the word queer because when he was growing up, when someone said it to you, it was never in a good way.
Yes.
So there's trauma attached to that word for him. For us, it's easier probably to reclaim it because it's not as held in our face in style to men as it used to be back in his day. So how do we balance reclaiming these words to name ourselves while also not being insensitive to people that have gone through the most and have been traumatized by those same words that are within our community?
This is a complex issue because some people accept other words, some people don't. Some people are even questioning, why do we have LGBTI? Why are we isolating ourselves from the rest of, the human race? But the fact of the matter is, we need to highlight issues and things that are affecting us. And we cannot highlight them if we don't say we are affected. I am affected as a human who identifies as a lesbian. So that's how the word comes out. But also I want to go back to the point that Sam was making, that it was easy for Corona that people come out with new names, precisely because there's no prejudice. There is prejudice in being ourselves, and how many of us will then accept those words? And also, we must also not underestimate the point that Jamil was pointing out around colonization, how colonization has shaped our minds, has shaped our thinking, and has shaped how we accept things, right? And the mere fact that we were put into a certain point and a certain position and a certain understanding of our own being as Africans. Anything that has African in it, it has taken a long time, and it's still an issue today for us to accept it.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I come in?
Go on.
I think it's going back to your question where you ask, is it possible for this to happen? I think it's really possible. Right now we have Afrikaans in South Africa. Afrikaans is a very new language. As much as it was forced by God, we can also force our languages onto people. But I guess how do we then not step on other people's toes when it comes to language? I think for me, for example, if I don't want to identify or use a particular language, I just choose not to use it. I think if a group of people decide that we want to use this word, that is very good for them, and I congratulate them. But I don't need to then, if it hurts me, have to use it. I might just not choose to use it. But like Virginia had said, it's a very sensitive and complex issue that maybe does need us to have more a bigger debate than what we are having now. But it can be done. It is very, very, very possible.
And let me say to you, that Afrikaans was not only brought by the gun, but there was economics and politics that was involved.
Yeah. So those things always play, and also religion. Those things play a big part in it. So maybe we could use the same method that they use when they use Afrikaans. We could use our economic power. We could use our religious power. We could use which we do have religious power.
Economic power.
We do have economic power. The only thing we don't have, Virginia, is land.
Land is economy. Land is power.
But also that context could be for people in Johannesburg. People in the Eastern Cape have land.
Can I just come in and ask about the issue of using our religious power and whatever power we can salvage to influence specific language? I'm not clear if we have this language that we want to influence people with. I'm asking because I can see that now we are agreeing that we need to, use collective bargaining, bring our economies together and our influence so that we can influence language into people. An example of Afrikaans. But the problem that I'm having is we don't have the language that we can influence, do we?
I think it's something that we need to. Something that we need to discuss because. I always like to use simple examples. Let's think about. I like Somizi, so I tend to watch a lot of his. He makes me laugh. When he's expressing himself and says "woo shame," now it's all over the place. It's on adverts and whatever. Was that even a word, or it was a self-expression? What does "woo shame" means? It's a word, but it's been adopted. So in our own discourse and conversations, whether at community levels, at regional level, and so on, I don't remember a platform where.
Sam, can I interject?
Yes.
Who is Somizi?
No, it's just some celebrity that I know from South Africa.
No, I'm coming to a point where you are saying whatever that he was saying, was adopted precisely because of his position in the society.
And I think in our gay community we do have influencers, isn't it? We do have gay influencers, and it's something that you just spoke yourself earlier. We do have the pink dollar power. When we are when I like the program that I think it's the other foundation does it with you guys. Virginia, you're familiar more with it, where you have business talking about scoring each other and so forth and so forth. Why not ask Coca-Cola to put it on a Coca-Cola bottle and say something about it? What that means, I'm not sure. But I'm just saying, we do have a certain power that we possess as a community. If you look at the way girls is seen even in country, other NGOs feel like we are the most powerful organizations, even though we don't feel like it ourselves, because they feel we are brave, we've survived Mugabe's time.
We've survived the ratings.
Exactly. So it means in some way, we do have a certain level of influence, a policy level within communities and what we stand for. So that is what we need to use in terms of culturing our own language. We can do, we have a leeway of working around that. We have a leeway of doing that. But I think where the challenge is, I think which was said earlier, would we have an agreement or collective bargaining that we can all win everyone to use the word? No, we are not trying to ask everybody to then fit into all these boxes.
Yeah.
But I think it's allowing that as language is diverse. The fact that people adopted gay, as an example, lesbian women sometimes don't want to be called gay. They really want to claim their identity. But other lesbian women can simply say, I'm gay, because gay is just used for all people that are within the rainbow color. Or people say I'm queer, it's encompassed. We can create that in our own language, because my difficulty for me is when I go back to my village where I spend most of my holidays, they have no clue what gay, lesbian, and whatever is. But they can describe to say, Maxim Matsikro of this house, he doesn't like women, he likes boys. Maybe they'll call it Ngochane. But what sort of Ngochane am I? They have no clue what that is. They just
Yeah.
bracket me. I can only educate them when I unpack what it is about me, the person, that they may appreciate. So I think we need to allow ourselves as a collective within the different platforms that already exist to start talking about these issues.
Yeah. There is power in language. I think we need to start wrapping up. I will start by asking to if there is something that you would like to leave as a parting shot around the question of trying to find dignified language.
For me, I think in our context, right, or maybe even Tabane for me is a word controversial. I think for the sake of visibility and for the sake of actually being, I am comfortable at the moment with LGBTI, with being labeled as a lesbian, because I mean, for the lack of currently a better word. It's not easy to bring in a new word in any space, especially in the sense of saying now the whole country must adopt a certain word just because a certain number of people want it. Unlike COVID, which is an international phenomenon. So I think we should tap into what we already have. I think we should try to make sure that wherever we go, we try as much as we can to explain it, to make people understand that there's nothing wrong with us, and these are the words that make us visible anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And we will have who's next?
Okay, I wanted to say there is a process that had begun in South Africa, which is called Finding New Words.
Okay.
It's a process which was started by some organization to go around the country and find out from, especially in the rural areas, what are the names that they would like to use. I'm not sure where the process is. Maybe instead of starting a new process, we can check that one and tap into that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bonella?
Can I say goodbye? Because I have another meeting coming up just now. But I think, thank you, my Lucy, for this. I think for me, it's quite important. And I've always found it difficult on how to express myself when it comes to language, and also to find a place where I can talk about language and talk about language, and also talk about colonialization and what it has done to me, and how I understand myself, and what I feel comfortable being called, and how it links to me for my identity being stolen away from me. But so I will say, I would like us to have this conversation again very soon. I hope which will have more role players in this, like Virginia has touched on the process that has started. Maybe we could look into them. What have they done, and what can we learn from them? But what is most important for me now, saying goodbye, is that our brothers and sisters are dying in Kenya and in Tanzania in the camps. And I would really like us to have a conversation about that as soon as possible, because what's happening in Kenya in the camps in Tanzania is really not nice. And in our lifetime, I didn't think it would happen when, especially now. I thought things would have been better. So maybe moving forward, Lucy or Virginia or whoever who will want to take the baton on leading us on how to... Yeah, kind of it, Jean. Maybe taking us forward in how do we help our brother, our person. Let me not say our brothers and sisters, our persons in that situation. Thank you, guys. I am going now. I have to log on to another one.
Thank you, Spo.
Thank you
Good
so
to
much.
see you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sammy, any last words?
Yeah, I think this was quite interesting, and I think, like Virginia said, maybe to also find, are there any initiatives that are happening, and how far are they? Because I feel for me, where our struggle is, if I'm referring to the Zimbabwean context, in creating more acceptance and awareness beyond the city borders where a lot of us live, is the issue of language. Because people keep throwing it back to us to say, this gay lesbian thing, these words, we don't know what these people are. We are borrowing it from the West. So the conversations, you cannot take it to a village and say I'm gay or trans or whatever. They would not understand it. And that's where most of the voters are who vote for the new constitution. The numbers game is really difficult in Africa because minorities are always left in policies and documents because of what the majority says. That's an obvious. So how do we create language that is able to be accepted, or accepted? Not only I don't want to say acceptable because I don't need to be accepted by anybody, but
popularized.
Exactly, to compromise on language that people can respect and understand who we are as a people in terms of in terms of our diversity. And I think that's a conversation that should continue to happen. And I support that you created this initiative. Let's continue to take it even now on regional platforms.
Coming into the meeting, I was I was already very sure that this is something that needs to happen. We do need to evolve our language to describe, all of us. But I just wasn't. I was quite skeptical on the fact that it can be done. That's the part that I had. I was doubtful of. But Sam seems very, adamant and convinced that it can happen. And he has swayed me. I suppose I do see his point. So I'm on board. I think moving forward, this is a conversation that we need to preach more often and talk about in our in our communities, so that we even get the general consensus on what words particularly are most people comfortable with, so that we know which words we're pushing out to the society, which words are we selecting and educating people on, and yeah, I think it's something that we need to take on.
Wow. Thank you so much to everybody. On my part, just the last word is to say that words matter and words have meaning. With meaning comes definition. Words have power, and with power comes responsibility.